Welcome to Books of Our Time, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law. Today we shall discuss two books by one of America's most famous historians of any political stripe, and certainly the most famous American historian from the left, Howard Zinn. The two books are You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train, A Personal History of Our Times, and Failure to Quit, Reflections of an Optimistic Historian. Professor Zinn is also the author of one of the most famous, and in the schools, one of the most widely adopted works of American history, called A People's History of the United States, which has sold over 1 million copies. Howard, thank you very much for coming up here. You know, on this show, Howard, I've had people, or this and other shows, I've had people as famous as Eugene McCarthy and the famous federal judge Richard Posner. And I want to say that it's a real privilege to have you, because in what you have done, you have worked something of an intellectual revolution in this country, no less than Posner has in a different field, and no less than Eugene McCarthy worked the revolution in politics in 1967 and 8. So I'm delighted to have you here, and let me start out by asking you this. As a man of the left, as they used to say in Britain, one would think that somebody with your views would be extremely disappointed with the way history has gone, and with the way in which you might foresee that it could go in the future. And yet you're not. You are a very optimistic guy, and you talk a lot about things always change, and the importance of small acts which cumulatively mount up. Why don't you get into all these reasons why you're so optimistic about American history in the future, for the future?
Okay, probably the word optimistic is a little misleading because it suggests something that I don't really believe, and that is, you know, that things will be okay tomorrow, next week, next month. I'm optimistic in the long run. In the short run, I see what everybody else sees. I see all the things that make people depressed. I see all the things that make people pessimistic. I see the wars. I see the starvation. I see, the terrible violence that is going on, the sickness of society. I see all of that. But I think the reason I'm optimistic for the long run is that I also, in my lifetime, and I don't like to say this, but my lifetime has now spanned many decades, right? And in my lifetime, I've seen enough change to suggest that more change is possible. I was in World War II. I saw a victory there when it looked impossible. I was in the Civil Rights Movement, involved there for 7 years, living in the South, and saw marvelous developments and triumphs that nobody ever expected. I was in the movement against the war in Vietnam, and there too, it seemed impossible, but the war finally ended, and we had a great movement against that war. And also, maybe more important, even today, as we are in the midst of a war which is very depressing because we see no end to it, and we see an administration in power which seems determined to have war after war after war in order to maintain American supremacy in the world. And yet, in the midst of this situation today, I see signs in the United States, and certainly all over the world, of people who are aware of what is happening and who do not go along with it. They're not going along with it doesn't mean that they have yet succeeded in changing policy.
Howard, I want to go back to the whole question of war in just a moment. But before we get there, and I think that what I'm about to ask relates closely to it. You talk a lot about the importance of what you call small acts that do not receive national publicity, and the way in which those acts, show that there's something stirring underneath, and ultimately, cumulatively, cause people and the nation to change. And you've seen a lot of this in your own history. Why don't you elaborate that a bit?
Yeah. When I was talking about that, I guess I was thinking primarily about my experience in the South.
Yeah.
Moving to Atlanta, Georgia in 1956, before there was a civil rights movement.
Yeah.
Well, yes, the Montgomery bus boycott
Yeah.
had taken place.
Yeah.
But now things were quiet. And there was no real expectation of a tumultuous change in the South. But I saw in Atlanta signs of unrest, of dissatisfaction. My students at Spelman College were quiet, reserved, polite, you might say controlled.
Yeah.
At the same time,
It was and is a women's college.
it was a women's, Spelman
Yeah.
College was a women's college.
Yeah.
At the same time, it was obvious that these students, although they were not yet breaking out of their controlled situation, had enormous resentment inside at the segregation in the South, at the humiliation that people of color endured every day in the South. And they began to act in small ways that were not noticed. And I was involved with them. You know, the Social Science Club at Spelman College decided, we'll try something small. We'll try desegregating the Atlanta Public Library.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they carried on a campaign,
Yeah.
which ultimately succeeded.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the kind of thing that didn't make headlines, it didn't like the sit-ins or freedom rides and so on.
Yeah.
But these little forays,
Yeah.
and these later on I discovered, these were taking place all over the South.
Yeah.
Put another way, before the famous 1960 sit-ins, there were many sit-ins
Yeah.
that didn't attract attention.
Yeah.
Before the
Yeah.
freedom rides,
Right.
there were attempts at freedom rides which didn't lead to anything big.
Right.
So I came to the conclusion that it's very important that people engage in even the smallest of actions, even if they don't seem to bring any immediate results.
Right.
Because it's these small actions that build and build and build
Yeah. Yeah.
and eventually come
Yeah.
to fruition.
Yeah, yeah. You talk a lot on a related subject about the need of human beings in this democracy, and I suppose it would go to any democracy, to seize the day, as it were, and if necessary in the streets, and build a democracy themselves, because you say democracy will not be handed to you by the courts, by the Congress, by the executive, by the governors. It is not given to you by the Constitution. And therefore people must go out and sometimes in the streets earn democracy themselves. Why don't you elaborate on that point of view that you express?
No, that's I think the way you express it is an accurate representation. Not everybody expresses accurately what I say, but you're doing it. So
it's funny, I have the same problem.
My point is that, you know, we grow up, we go to school, we go to junior high school. They teach us about, in my day they used to call it civics. I don't know if they still do.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
they teach us about government, and they teach us about democracy, and they talk about the three branches of government and the checks and balances. And they give you the impression that this is what democracy is about, that you can put democracy on the blackboard and make a diagram and show the executive and the judiciary and the legislative and the arrows going. Well, of course, historically, that's not how change has come about. And the experience of black people is one striking example of it. Even after the 14th and 15th Amendments were added to the Constitution after the Civil War, it didn't matter. The law wasn't going to be enforced by the President of the United States. And so in order to make the 14th and 15th Amendments come alive, black people had to take it unto themselves, which is what they did in the 50s and 60s. And this is also true of the labor movement. With the labor movement, perhaps even more dramatic, because the labor movement didn't even have amendments to the Constitution that gave them rights in the way that black people finally got rights in the 14th, 15th Amendments. And working people with no constitutional rights, because the Constitution, after all, is not a document that favors the economic needs of people. Roosevelt saw that. That's why he proposed at one point an economic Bill of Rights. No, the Constitution does not provide a right to health care or to housing or to food. And so working people had to go out and strike and boycott, face the police, face the National Guard. They had to do it themselves. That's how the 8-hour day was won.
Yeah, yeah. You know, you make a point that I find very striking, because it's exactly the same point made by the most capitalistic of people, but they make it from the other direction. You make the point that people overvalue the present, and they extrapolate that the future will be exactly like the present, and tain't so, which is one of the reasons that I guess you're optimistic for the long term. And the funny thing is, you read about the stock market, and they say, yeah, that's exactly the problem that people have in the stock market. They think whatever's going on today will keep going on, and it's not true. It's just a sort of a typical human thing. Let's talk just a little bit about the war, since you did bring it up, and then we'll go back to a couple other things you just mentioned. You say that some method of, well, I'll put it this way, doing away with war, if we can, is the central issue of our time. You're not a pacifist, as I understand it, but you do have a great revulsion at war, as do some of the rest of us. What caused you to develop this revulsion? Let me say, for the audience's sake, you'll elaborate this, that actually in World War II, when you were a young kid, you were 18, you just graduated from high school, you had a job in a shipyard building American naval, which would have deferred you from combat and from joining the service. And in fact, you worked on the USS Iowa, which was one of America's most powerful battleships. It was the one that the turret blew up just a few years ago. And yet you went off, you undertook one of the most dangerous jobs in the war. You were flying, I think you were a bombardier, if I remember correctly, on B-17s. And those people did not have a long lifespan. There was the worst casualty rate probably in that than in the infantry. So you started off as sort of gung-ho, you know, in favor of our military, and you've gone 180 in the other direction. Why don't you explain what has motivated you and what continues to motivate you?
Well, when I was gung-ho, as you'd say, and enlisting in the Air Force in World War, they called it the Army Air Corps at that time, in World War II, it wasn't because I was a militarist in general. It was because I believed that this war, this specific war, World War II, was absolutely necessary in order to defeat, you know, what seemed the most horrible phenomenon of modern times, and that is fascism, Nazism. And so enthusiastically, I joined and I flew bombing missions over Europe. But what happened is that at the end of the war, I began to have more complicated thoughts about war. I say more complicated thoughts because it's not that I went simply from being pro-war to anti-war. It's just that it seemed to me, looking back on World War II as I did shortly after, it was not simply a good war. You may notice that Studs Terkel, in his oral history, which is entitled The Good War, puts quotation marks around the good war. Because so many of the people he interviewed who were in World War II later expressed doubts about the purity of that war.
If I may interject something, we've had a fellow who wrote a history of World War II on these shows, Howard, and there seems to be absolutely no question whatsoever that in the Pacific, on both sides, it was a race war.
Yes. John, I don't know if you had John Dower on.
No, we had Donald Miller on.
You had?
Donald Miller on.
I see. Yeah, well, John Dower wrote a book about that fact, just what you were talking about, that there were atrocities on both sides, you know, and history is always written, almost always written from a nationalistic point of view. And so when we write our history or when our journalists talk about World War II, it's always the Japanese cruelties, the Bataan Death March and so on, which is true, of course. But what they omit, of course, is, you know, our cruelties and our atrocities. And you know, John Dower wrote a book called War Without Mercy, which deals with that and redresses that balance. Well, what I in fact, what began my rethinking about war was right after the war when I read John Hersey's Hiroshima. Mm-hmm. And John Hersey had gone to Hiroshima after the bombing, and he interviewed the people who were the victims of that bombing and who were still alive. And his account of it was so personal, so human, so harrowing, that I, who had accepted the bombing of Hiroshima when it happened, well, I don't have to go to the Pacific now. The war is over. And I didn't think about the human consequences of that bombing. And that made me rethink my own missions and realized that I had never understood the human consequences of the bombing missions that I was flying. I didn't realize that I was bombing really indiscriminately. And all this talk about, which they still, talk about, precision bombing, accurate bombing, we only bomb military targets. It was all nonsense. It was nonsense then, and it's nonsense now.
They started saying that in those days because of what was then a new device, the Norden bomb sight.
That's right.
And actually we were engaging, as were the British, in area bombing to a large extent. Now, when you talk about Hiroshima, there are people who can say, and it's not my purpose to get into that discussion here, but merely to point out that there are people who say that the atomic bombings may have saved millions of lives on both sides. But be that as it may, you participated in the bombing of Royan. Afterwards, you could find no legitimate excuse for that bombing at all, and it took hundreds, as I understand it, of French lives on the ground.
Yes. I don't want to bypass Hiroshima.
Okay.
Because it is still one of the great myths in American culture that we saved lives by bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we did not. And I've done a lot of research on that, and the most elaborate research job on that, done by Gar Alperovitz and a crew of scholars, makes it clear we did not save lives. Japanese were about to surrender. We killed several 100,000 people unnecessarily. And but I want to say something else about that, which goes not only to Hiroshima, but to bombing in general, I think. And I would ask people who say we had to do it in order to save lives. I would say, well, if it was in August 1945, and you knew that we could end the war with Japan more quickly, because that's what it was about, ending it more quickly, not ending it because we knew it would end and the Japanese were on their way to defeat, but ending it more quickly by dropping a bomb, would you be willing to kill 100,000 American children to end the war more quickly? Well, the answer to that is obvious. Nobody would say yes. But you're willing to kill 100,000 Japanese children in order to end the war more quickly? What does that mean? What does that say about the way we think about other people? What does that say about war? What does it say about our willingness to kill other people because their lives are not as important as ours? Okay, I know you didn't want to get into Hiroshima.
All right, that's all right.
Because, but I couldn't let that go because it's such an important myth in American culture.
Well, what that brings me to is this. And I must say, I think there should be more writing on one side and the other about the question of were the Japanese about to surrender and what would the casualties have been. But putting that to one side for a moment, my understanding is that, and I think you probably agree with this, and my intent here is to ask you why you think it's true, is that much of the rest of the world, much is an ambiguous word. I don't know what other word to use. Much of the rest of the world considers America as the premier terrorist in the world today. And as I understand, that has a lot to do with our use of bombs and other kinds of really vicious weapons. Whether it's better or worse to kill people one way or another, that's another question. But am I right in thinking that you yourself, because of the massive bomb, because of the fact you inevitably kill civilians, I guess that's what I'm trying to say. You inevitably kill civilians.
That's right.
Do you think that it's fair to say that, and Americans certainly don't want to hear this, we certainly don't want to hear this, Do you think it's fair to say that much of the rest of the world considers us major terrorists?
I think there's no question about it. I mean, recent polls in the past few years have shown that people in other parts of the world consider President Bush more dangerous than Osama bin Laden, more dangerous than Saddam Hussein. Now, why is that? I mean, to American ears, that's unimaginable. But what they see the United States having suffered a terrorist attack, 9/11, terrible terrorist attack. They see the United States responding by its own terrorism, not by focusing on who did this attack, let's find them, not treating it like a police operation or an international police operation, but simply going ahead and bombing Afghanistan, killing 3,000 or more civilians in Afghanistan without any particular effect on Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, terrorism. And then you see us going into Iraq. And now, and I've just recently seen figures by an organization that has worked very hard to compile figures on the civilian dead in Iraq as a result of this very short war, and they come up with figures like 10, 15, 20,000 civilians. Americans don't even know this because all we're focused on is the fact that every day we lose another 2, 1, 3 soldiers, several hundred by now. But when the rest of the world knows this better than we do, they get better news than we do. They don't listen to Fox television. They don't listen to CNN. They have much better news sources. They know what the United States has done. And also, I think this is also true, they have a memory of Vietnam, which is being lost in the United States. To me, it's interesting that in our culture and on television and in the movies, they're bringing back World War II in a very heavy way. Saving Private Ryan, and the stories of D-Day and the 101st Airborne, bringing back World War II. Why? Because World War II immediately conjures up the image of a just war and the enemy as Hitler. They don't bring up Vietnam. But among Europeans, and I think other people in the world who opposed the American war in Vietnam, to a far greater extent and earlier than the Americans did, they still remember that the United States was responsible for killing several million people in Vietnam. They can't forget that. So they see the history of the United States in Vietnam, Central America, supporting death squads in Central America, the results being hundreds of thousands of lives being lost in Guatemala, El Salvador. They know this in a way that Americans don't.
There were 3 million people dead in Vietnam. And I suppose had we not intervened, the figure would have been a few 100,000, perhaps as many as 1 million. But 3 million, not a chance, not a chance. People don't remember what the havoc that our sanctions wrought in the last 10 years on Iraq. Putting aside the question of whether Saddam Hussein is a good man or a bad man, nobody's going to say Saddam Hussein is anything but horrendously evil. But it was children who basically bore the brunt, as I understand it, who basically bore the brunt of our sanctions there.
Yeah. Here's another instance of how the media have kept the American people really ignorant of what has been going on. Because what you talked about, the sanctions that were going on for 10 years, and by the way, under both Democratic and Republican administrations, before people get to idealistic and romantic about the Democrats. These sanctions, according to the UN, killed perhaps 1 million people and several 100,000 children.
We have to take, excuse me for one, so we have to take a quick break for a public service commercial. Sure. We'll come right back and we'll continue discussing this, this subject. Stay with us. We'll be right back with Howard Zinn. Those of you who watch Books of Our Time know that many of our programs are about books that deal with history. This reflects not just my own interest in history, but also the widespread belief that we would do better if our people and leaders knew more about history. This belief is one of the important reasons why the Massachusetts School of Law is starting a new and unique college called the American College of History and Legal Studies, ACHLS. ACHLS will be a senior college, offering the junior and senior years of undergraduate education. It will focus entirely on American history, including the history of some important fields of American law. It will offer specific pathways to law school for those who choose to become lawyers, including entrance into law school after the junior year for those who do well at ACHLS, and education which rigorously prepares those who choose other fields than law. Its teaching will be entirely by the discussion method, in which all students participate, as at MSL itself and other fine law schools. It will have very small classes of only 15 to 20 students. Its tuition will be only $10,000 per year, much lower than almost any other college offering a bachelor's degree. You can view ACHLS's catalog online at the web address on your screen. ACHLS will be opening in Salem, New Hampshire, which is on the New Hampshire-Massachusetts border, in August of 2010. If you would like further information about ACHLS or would like an application, call, write, or email Maureen Mooney at the phone number or addresses shown on your screen. Welcome back. Howard, before the break, you had mentioned, we had both mentioned, Americans don't like to hear certain things about our society because we tend to grow up with a view of America as being almost solely a righteous and virtuous country. And to some extent, I think that comes from the media, and to some extent it comes from the vast miswriting, or I should say one-sided writing, of American history. And I take it that this had something to do with your decision to write the book that's called A People's History of the United States. Am I right in that? And why don't you, whether I'm right or wrong, why don't you explain how you came to write that book and what impact it has had? It has, after all, sold 1 million copies, which for a history book is pretty amazing.
You know, I think I came to write that book because I was looking for a book like it and couldn't find it. Yeah. You know, I suspect that a lot of books are written for that reason. You know, you're looking for a certain kind of book. It's not there, so I'll sit down and write it. Right. Take a few days out of my life.
Well, why were you looking for a book like that?
Well, I was looking for a book like that because, and I think this came from my experience in the South. Here I was in the midst of all sorts of incredible dramatic events going on. You know, from Atlanta and my students involved in sit-ins and myself involved too in demonstrations and picket lines. And then I left Atlanta and went down to Albany, Georgia to cover the big demonstrations in Albany, Georgia. I became involved with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and they sort of invited me to be on their executive board. And then I went to Selma, Alabama, and various towns in Mississippi, and all these amazing things happening.
You were right in the middle of some of the most, I mean, that was like being in all the big battles of World War II, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I felt like I was John Reed, writing 10 Days That Shook the World, you know, in the midst of those crowds in Leningrad. So, and so I noticed that so many things that were going on were simply not being reported. And I realized, and I extrapolated from that, and I said, in every era, there must be all sorts of amazing things happening that never get into the newspapers, that never get into the history books.
Yeah.
And what they are mostly are the doings of ordinary people and the resistance of ordinary people. And that our histories, like our newspapers and like television, tend to focus on the important people. You know, you watch public television, and public television is supposed to be better, more broad-minded than commercial television. But you watch public television and you see, let's say, the Lehrer NewsHour. Certainly spending more time on important subjects than commercial radio stations. But who do you see on the NewsHour? You see important people.
Okay.
You know, you see experts. You
Right.
see secretaries of state. You see congressmen and senators.
Right. The big shot theory of news and history.
Exactly. And in history, in the history books, what are history books written? They're written about presidents.
Yeah.
This is the age of Lincoln. This is the age of Roosevelt. This is the age of Jackson.
Yeah.
Here are the founding fathers. Well, instead of talking about the founding fathers, how about talking about Shays' Rebellion? How about talking about the farmers in western Massachusetts who rebelled against the rich in Boston? Instead of talking about George Washington and the great victories in the Revolutionary War, or I should say not instead of, but in addition to,
Yeah.
how about talking about the soldiers in Washington's army who mutinied against the officers, who mutinied because they were being treated like dirt, and the officers were getting these resplendent uniforms and all this food and high pay. Where are those soldiers and those mutinies in the history books? And so I extrapolated from all of that and came to the conclusion that the doings of ordinary people, what happens to ordinary people, their victimization and also their rebellions, aren't there in the history books.
Yeah.
So I wanted to write about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now I wanted to, for instance, the history books stress the economic miracle of the United States, especially after the Civil War. That period after the Civil War, the United States becomes a great industrial power, and the railroads spanning the country and the steel mills going up. And,
Yep. Yep.
but I wanted to read about and hear about the people who worked in those steel mills, the people who worked on the railroads, the Irish immigrants, the Chinese immigrants who worked on the Transcontinental Railroad and died in large numbers.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I wanted to hear about the strikers of 1877 and the Pullman car strikers and here's an interesting to me, of course. After I began to read on my own and read the history of labor struggles in this country, and saw that they were not there in the history books. Now, I have a PhD in history. I went to graduate school as a history major. In none of my history books did they talk about the Colorado coal strike of 1913-14, about the Ludlow Massacre.
Yeah.
And Woody Guthrie wrote a song about the Ludlow Massacre, but it was not in the history books.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the most dramatic events in American history. So the Lawrence textile strike. I mean, here we are sitting.
Right.
We are in Lawrence, aren't we? Or near
actually,
Lawrence.
we are. We are.
We are in Lawrence.
Yeah.
The great textile strike in Lawrence in 1912.
The bread and roses strike,
immigrant women who seemed helpless, striking against the great, textile companies.
Yeah.
And winning. Wasn't there in the history books. So I wanted to bring that.
Yeah. And I take it that what you've done has had a dramatic impact in the last 10 or 15 years because, if I understand right, high school teachers and college teachers all over the United States adopt your book as supplemental reading to sort of offset. I think the key phrase is what you said, in addition to, not instead of, but in addition to all the laudatory stuff that we read about America and our leaders. Here were all these other problems, and here were some of the small people were thinking and were doing and were suffering while all this was going on.
It's interesting that when my book first came out, high school teachers were very reluctant to use it, not for themselves, but they saw the school committees looking over their shoulders and. What are you giving our kids? In fact, some high school teacher on the West Coast wrote to me, La Jolla, California, wrote to me and said she was in trouble because she had used my book, and the kid brought my book home. The parent looked at her mother, looked at the first chapter of the book, which deals with Columbus. And of course, there it's a very different story I give of Columbus, not the great hero, but the murderer, the kidnapper. Her parents looked at this and said, her mother was horrified. Columbus is a hero. I mean, this must be a communist book, right? And she asked for an investigation of this teacher. Well, that's what happened then. But over the years, more and more high school teachers have begun to use my book, and it's become, I hate to say this, respectable to use my book.
You're done.
Yes. So it's used in high schools and, of course, colleges all over the country. High schools are more difficult to enter because, you know, high schools are kind of totalitarian institutions. Things are so controlled in high schools. But I think you're right that there's been a change in education. Not enough of a change still, but there's been a change. And now I would say there are hundreds of thousands of teachers all over the country who are teaching in a different way. They're teaching the story of Columbus. They're doing more black history. They're doing more women's history. And, you know, I don't attribute it simply to my book. I attribute it to the movements of the 60s, which made people more conscious of race, of sex, of, you know, of all these people.
The 60s have gotten a really terrible rap from the conservative movement in this country in the last 10 to 20 years. And I think really the 60s are responsible for much of the good that has gone on in the country in the last 40 years.
It's interesting that what you say about the treatment of the 60s. They're trying to present the 60s. And when I've looked at the 60s treated on television, this is what I've seen. Emphasis on sort of crazed kids, drugs, you know, wild violence. I mean, of course there were, you know, those elements were there, but the 60s, by and large, was a marvelous time in American history when millions of people became involved in social movements, nonviolent social movements for change. You know, a time of the flower children, a time when the generosity seemed to be more prevalent. When you would stop on the road and give a ride to hitchhikers, and people don't do that anymore. And no, the 60s were a wonderful period of new consciousness and social change.
Well, and a time when people were much more cognizant of equality, whether it's for gays, whether it's for racial minorities, women, you name it, and of the controlling nature of so much of what we had been taught. You yourself seem to feel that education has been largely used in this country by the powers that be, whoever they may be, the people with money, the people with position, to more or less brainwash. I hate to use George Romney's word, but to brainwash children into accepting a place in the society as these people wanted it to be, and they gave all kinds of Holy Toledo, you know, to teachers who would teach something different. And do you think there's been any diminution in this use of education and the media to control what American people think and what the next generation thinks?
Oh, it's still going on. I just read about a teacher in school in North Carolina who lost her job, who was simply dismissed because she brought up in class the war. She wanted her students to discuss the war. And no, you mustn't talk about that. And you know, soon she got a letter saying, you know, this is unacceptable, you're out. I mean, this is just one example.
You know, there's something the matter with North Carolina because the state university down there, and I'm only half kidding, the University of North Carolina has this new program where incoming freshmen read a particular book and then everybody in the university discusses it during the first, and 2 straight years now they've just caught hell because people haven't liked the book that, I don't even remember what the books were that were chosen. But the university just caught Hades throughout the state for choosing whatever books it chose because these books didn't reflect, you know, only well on our society.
It's interesting that education in our country has always been pro-war. Pro-war in the sense of exalting military heroism. I mean, these are our heroes. These are the statues in our cities, are the statues of military heroes. And kids, you know, grow up from elementary school on with a kind of reverence for you know, the people who won the wars.
Can I ask you a question, Howard, about that? You make a most striking comment in one of the two books that are the subject of today's program, maybe in both. You say that our leaders are addicted to war. Addicted to war. Why do you say that?
Well, the sign of an addiction, I suppose, is when somebody keeps coming back to something that's bad for you and can't seem to get out of it, and somebody who sees, for instance, a drug as a solution to their problems, you know, not looking for other solutions, because drugs are a quick solution to a problem that you have. You know, you're unhappy, you're depressed, or you're in pain, and yes, the drug will be a quick fix.
So is
but
it fair
war
to say
is a quick fix. War is a quick fix. You're attacked, you know, as in 9/11. What do? Instead of stopping and thinking intelligently about what caused this act, what was behind it, what can we do to eliminate the causes of it, you go to that drug which you have always used, and war. War is the way to solve the problem.
Howard, I was talking to somebody the other day, and I was making some of these points that you were making, and the person said to me, and I'm interested in your response to this. The person said to me, look, it's kind of like a play on the poor you will always have with you. You will always have people in this world who want to attack us no matter what we do or how nice we try to be. And therefore, we have to attack these people first or mightily or whatever. What's your response to that?
Well, first of all, when I say there'll always be people, they mean there'll always be governments. I think that's an important distinction that must be made. There are a lot of, I think there's a lot of thinking that goes on which puts the blame for war on people. And you know, they even find biological impulses to violence and aggression. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a lot of nonsense. If that were true, that is, if people had an inherent desire to go to war, nations would not have to compel them. Nations would not have to draft armies. They would not have to seduce people with propaganda and persuade them that this is a just cause. No, people's natural tendency, I think, is not to engage in wars. But you know, when they say, well, we must engage in war because other nations engage in war, well, of course, that creates the vicious cycle. And they're not asking the question, how can we get at the roots of war? It's like the present Israeli, you know, Palestinian situation. The Palestinians are, you know, sending suicide bombers, you know. So we have to then attack Palestinian territory and destroy homes, and then the Palestinians say, well, you see what they're doing to us. More, and it's a cycle.
Vicious cycle.
And the United States has contributed to that cycle. In fact, I would argue that...
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
Excuse me. But I'm getting wild waves here that I have to break for the second public interest commercial. We'll be right back. Stay with us. We'll be right back with more with Howard Zinn. Those of you who watch Books of Our Time know that many of our programs are about books that deal with history. This reflects not just my own interest in history, but also the widespread belief that we would do better if our people and leaders knew more about history. This belief is one of the important reasons why the Massachusetts School of Law is starting a new and unique college called the American College of History and Legal Studies, ACHLS. ACHLS will be a senior college offering the junior and senior years of undergraduate education. It will focus entirely on American history, including the history of some important fields of American law. It will offer specific pathways to law school for those who choose to become lawyers, including entrance into law school after the junior year for those who do well at ACHLS, and education which rigorously prepares those who choose other fields than law. Its teaching will be entirely by the discussion method, in which all students participate, as at MSL itself and other fine law schools. It will have very small classes of only 15 to 20 students. Its tuition will be only $10,000 per year, much lower than almost any other college offering a bachelor's degree. You can view ACHLS's catalog online at the web address on your screen. ACHLS will be opening in Salem, New Hampshire, which is on the New Hampshire-Massachusetts border, in August of 2010. If you would like further information about ACHLS or would like an application, call, write, or email Maureen Mooney at the phone number or addresses shown on your screen.
Before you start an online relationship with a guy, think about how it could end.
The Massachusetts School of Law at Andover offers an accessible, affordable legal education to both full-time and part-time law students. When making admissions decisions, MS Law looks at all aspects of the candidate's qualifications and does not consider the flawed LSAT. At a tuition of less than half of all the other law schools in New England, it is by far the most affordable. Our teaching and standards are rigorous. Our students learn to think clearly, to write well, and to advocate effectively for others. Decide today to make a difference.
Welcome back to our discussion with Howard Zinn. Howard, you have taken the position, which is awfully hard to argue with, really, that the media act as the handmaidens to war, with the latest example perhaps being this embedding of troops. So American television was rah-rah as we're going forward and riding in the tanks and so forth. But why don't you elaborate historically and currently on your view of the media in this country being the handmaiden to war?
Well, first of all, it's important to understand, excuse me, that the media, the major media, I'm not talking about little media, I'm not talking about small newspapers, small radio stations, television, but the major media have always been owned, controlled by people of wealth. And therefore, the editorial positions, the choice of news items has always been determined, by those people who control the press. I think it was A.J. Liebling, the writer, who said, "Freedom of the press belongs to whoever owns the press." And back in the early part of the 20th century, Upton Sinclair wrote a book called The Brass Check. The brass check was something used in houses of prostitution in Paris. And he was talking about the press as prostitutes, the press as selling out for money. Press has, well, in fact, at that very time, talk about the press being pro-war, the Hearst newspapers and the Pulitzer papers revved up the country for war with Spain.
Yeah. You provide the reporting, I'll provide the war. Isn't that Hearst told us?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And in World War I, again, the press played up the German atrocities, and some of them turned out to be false. The Lusitania has been sunk, a harmless passenger ship. Later it turns out it was carrying war munitions. And playing up the atrocities of the Germans, not saying anything about the British Empire. Yeah. And that's been going on. Today, what we see is, when the war started in Afghanistan, to call it a war is actually a misnomer. I mean, this isn't a war between two equal parties, the United States and Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a helpless, miserable country, and the United States bombs Afghanistan, and it's called a war. And what happens then is that executives in CNN send out word to their reporters, and I've seen this, it was leaked by people in CNN, send out word to their reporters saying, let's not report civilian casualties in Afghanistan. We were bombing and we were killing civilians. They were not to be reported. And CNN began festooning the stand of the anchors of CNN with American flags, and the media, you know, have been going along with war for a very long time.
Actually, the rest of the world, as I understand it, well, apropos of that, you know, Vietnam was in a sense different because the reporters were investigating the truth, and their editors and publishers at least didn't block them from publishing it. But the editorial and publishers' positions, at least early in the war, were worlds different than what you were reading from the reporters of the New York Times and Time magazine and so forth.
That's an interesting point. In the early 1968, the Boston Globe did a survey of, I think, something like 29 major American dailies. Not one of them called for the United States to get out of Vietnam. I'm particularly conscious of this because in 1967 I wrote a book called Vietnam, The Logic of Withdrawal.
Right.
And suggesting strongly the United States should get no major daily in 1968 supported the idea of getting out of Vietnam.
Right. And you know, this really hasn't changed, but the rest of the world sees television through television, sees a very different war than Americans see on Fox and CNN and CBS. They see the civilian casualties, they see the bombs falling, and so on and so forth. So you have a real disconnect, I think, between the way we, thinking we're a virtuous country, see the war, and the way other countries see the war.
It's interesting. You may remember that both in the Afghan War and in this war in Iraq, that the United States bombed the offices of Al Jazeera, the Mid-Eastern television network. They did not want that network to be able to show pictures of the results of our bombing. I mean, this is the kind of thing that happens in a totalitarian state. In the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, they shut down newspapers, they shut down television stations, they want to control everything. This is the way the United States government has behaved in these wars.
But Howard, what is your response to those people who say that you and people who believe as you do, and, you know, I include myself to a large extent in that. We don't see eye to eye on everything, but I see eye to eye with you on an awful lot. What do you say to people who say, well, you're being unpatriotic?
Well, you know, I think this also is part of our culture, I think, and that is a misguided notion of what patriotism is. I think we grow up in this country very often with the idea, which is inculcated from the beginning. You pledge allegiance to the flag and sing the Star-Spangled Banner and exalt military heroism. Grow up with the idea that to be patriotic means to support whatever the government does. And if you oppose the government, if you criticize the government, you're being unpatriotic. To think that way is a violation of basic democratic principles. The Declaration of Independence establishes the democratic principle. Governments are artificial creations. Governments are set up by the people to ensure certain rights: equality, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. When governments become destructive of those rights, that's what the Declaration of Independence says, it is the right of people to alter or abolish the government. If it's the right of people to alter or abolish the government, then certainly the right of people to criticize the government. The government and the people. You know, I see on television young fellows going off to war, as I did way back, and I see the television interviewer asks, well, young man, how do you feel about going off to Iraq? I said, well, I feel that I owe something to my country. It's not your country that you're fighting for when you go to war. It's your government. It's Halliburton. It's the great corporations. It's the people who benefit from war. It's the politicians. It's the industrialists. It's not the country.
Would it be fair to say, Howard, that you think that, I know Lincoln thought this, which loads it up by my having said that, but would it be fair to say that you think patriotism essentially consists of loyalty to the underlying principles of the United States, and that to some extent that whole notion of patriotism has been hijacked by those who believe in military action?
Yeah, Lincoln had it right. Mark Twain had it right. Mark Twain said, this notion, my country right or wrong, you know, is absurd. No. And patriotism should mean adhering, as you were just saying, to the principles of the country. And I would suggest that one of our principles, although we haven't followed it through, one of our principles should be to behave in the world like a peace-loving country, not to initiate wars. We have initiated wars. It's one thing when we're attacked. It's another thing when we initiate wars. We initiated a war in Vietnam. We initiated wars in Panama, in Grenada, in Afghanistan, in Iraq twice. We've initiated those wars.
Initiated the Mexican and the Spanish wars, if you want to go back to the last century.
The Mexican War, the Spanish-American War, no question about it. The war in the Philippines, we initiated it.
Yeah.
And that, we should consider that to go against principles that our country should stand for.
Yeah. Howard, do you think the writing of history is fundamentally subjective, not only in the way that the things are said, you know, what you stress in the first part of the sentence versus what the tail of the sentence says, not only in the way that things are said, but also in the sense of what is put in and what is left out of the history books?
I think that is the most important way in which history is distorted. If you say something false in a historical description, it can be verified or not verified, be counteracted. But if you leave something out, the person reading it has no idea that you've left it out.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And if you tell the story of the Civil War, and it's all battles,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and you leave out the fact that during the Civil War, the U.S. Army did not only fight against the Confederacy, but it fought against the Indians out west, and it committed massacres during the Civil War. And during the Civil War, more land was taken from the Indians than in any comparable period in American history. That is left out of the books. And Native Americans know what is left out.
Yep.
Black people know what is left out. People who are interested in labor struggles know what is left out. And they certainly, leave out, when they talk about World War I, they leave out the huge movement against World War I that took place at that time.
Yeah. Howard, we have to wrap this up. This is why I wanted to do 2 hours rather than one,
Okay.
but we can't. So we have to wrap this up. I want to thank you very much for coming up here and recommend to everybody that these books are just intensely interesting. Failure to Quit, and you can't be neutral on a moving train. Again, I thank you for what for the way you've opened the eyes of a lot of people in this country over the last 15 to 20 years.
Thank you, Larry.
So thank you for being up here.